Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining today, this presentation on the School of Aviation at Swinburne University in conjunction with the HKU space. So my name is Salim Hijazeen. I'll be taking you through the presentation today. Just a little bit about me. I am part of the School of Aviation at Swinburne University, which is led by Professor Zhang and Professor Tommy also. So today's presentation will go over some of my research. I'd like to share what my current research is on in terms of my PhD and talk about the course here at Swinburne, the aviation course, and talk about the industry as a whole, just to give some perspective and context in terms of where the industry currently is and where it's going in the future. And I'll turn off my camera at this stage just so it's not distracting, as I believe it's coming up on the bottom of the screen. So I'll just do that now. Okay, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat and I can respond to them as we go. But if it's not urgent, you feel free to ask right at the end of the presentation or even after the call. That's all good with me. I've left my contact details at the end. Okay, so my PhD research, I'm just over a year into my research and it focuses on advanced air mobility aircraft. So if you're not too sure what that is, the best way to explain it is it's got similar performance in terms of takeoff and landing like a helicopter, so vertical takeoff and landing, and it also flies like a fixed wing aircraft. But there are many different performances and gives much more opportunities. So that's what my research is on, and it's basically focusing on the vertiport infrastructure of advanced air mobility aircraft and how we integrate this aircraft type into an existing airport, such as Melbourne Airport or the airport in Hong Kong. Doesn't really matter, really, but essentially, how do we integrate this new technology into an existing airport without impacting current airport operations, air traffic control, I guess, efficiency. So at the moment, I'm working on a simulation model, which is looking at modeling different types of vertiport infrastructure, understanding how the passengers will transfer, how long do aircraft need on the ground. And once I establish that model, I'll understand, okay, what is the impact to an existing airport? So I'm currently gathering data from an airport, and just understanding, okay, if we do implement AAMs, what are the challenges? And also, are current regulations adequate? Is ATC at the moment, their capabilities adequate also? Because there will be different performances. And also keep in mind, there would be different power sources. So some will be battery powered, and in the future, there will be hydrogen powered AAMs. But that also brings more challenges because we need to understand how do we securely store hydrogen at an airport, given it's quite combustible. But obviously there's many benefits such as green hydrogen. So basically no emissions, so no impact to the environment, cheaper long term, but at this point, prices are still quite high. So it probably won't happen until potentially the 2050s, until when hydrogen is the same price as current Jet A1 fuel, but we'll see what happens in the coming years and decades. Interestingly, they will be used at the Paris Olympics this year. So keep an eye out and see what learnings we could potentially take from Paris. But essentially, it will be a new sector in the industry, and it's nothing, it still hasn't been implemented in terms of commercially, but there is a lot starting to pick up, a lot of businesses picking up in the US now and across Europe. And these operations can be manned and unmanned. So you can have pilots on board and without pilots. And as I mentioned, they're all going to have different performances. So that's the challenge. How do you build infrastructure and support the air traffic management around an airport for aircraft that need to come in a bit quicker and a bit slower than others? And some of the applications include transferring passengers freight, which is similar to what happens now in aviation, but also there are benefits such as, say, medical evac missions. If a person in a remote area of, say, in Australia requires medical evacuation, then perhaps an AEM can land in a place where a helicopter cannot until road transport gets there or something like that. So there are many applications, and Obviously, they're much quieter than normal aircraft. So in the medical field, they may be very beneficial. And here's just a quick summary of a bit of the background. So by 2040, in the next just over a decade and a half, we should see the industry at $1.5 trillion, and that's US dollar. And the potential for green hydrogen, as I mentioned, the only challenge at the moment is to produce green hydrogen, the whole supply chain needs to be green or else it defeats the purpose. So we need to ensure that the whole supply chain is green, along with how do we store it safely. And then there's the question, is it gas form or is it liquid form? And the vertiport infrastructure. So I should have explained earlier, vertiport infrastructure, the way you can think about it is similar to a helipad and an airport terminal. So initially in the early days, AAMs will be able to utilize helipads where there aren't too many AAMs operating, so infrastructure requirements may not be as important in the early days. But first and foremost, we need to ensure safety. So it's the development of regulations at the moment. So for the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, and take learnings from the FAA and EASA. So with the Europeans and the Americans. And you can see on this map here, hopefully you can see it well, you have countries such as Japan who lead the way, and you got some in India and the US also. Okay, so now I'd like to move on to the presentation in terms of Swinburne University. If you do have any questions about my research, absolutely feel free to reach out to me, and I've got my contact details at the end, and we can discuss further. But in terms of Swinburne University, so I am doing my PhD at Swinburne University, and I'm also a sessional lecturer here. So currently teaching Bachelor students in aviation management and flying students. And in terms of the university, it ranks quite highly with these two different rankings here. So in the QS World University rankings, ranked 285th in the world, and in the top 250 for the other ranking, which is the in 2024 this year. So the Higher Education World University rankings, higher, I should say. And also with the third one here, it's in the top 200, which is a great effort. And we're continuing to improve. And I'll talk about this shortly, how we're doing that and what's exciting coming in the coming months and years. Okay, so yeah, why Swinburne University? Well, it's innovative in what we do, and that photo that you can see there on the right is an Airbus A320 simulator, which we just installed last year. It's based out of Switzerland. It's a wonderful tool for our students, both management and flying students, and I'll go through it later on in the presentation in terms of what it's utilized for, because this is housed at the university campus, and it's different to the flying school. And the university, obviously, we have, especially in our aviation school, we have a lot of industry personnel. We have great connections with airlines such as Qantas, Jetstar, and airports such as Melbourne Airport and Air Services Australia, which look after air traffic control. And a lot of our academic staff have worked in the industry for a long time, some even from the 1960s, which have a lot of experience from starting up airlines such as passenger operations and cargo operations. And what's more important is having, or what's most important is having that industry connection. So students, once they do graduate and as they're learning throughout the course, they can engage with real industry. And I think that's where the real learning happens, when you can apply what you've learned at university from industry professionals to the workplace. And the work integrated learning industry projects, I'll go through that later on. And just to give you a quick overview, it's where students receive a briefing, like an industry problem from a client. The client can be Cathay Pacific, it could be Qantas, and the students start working on those projects. So I'll go into more detail with those projects later on. I'll just check if I've got any questions. No questions at this stage. Okay. So in terms of where I'm sitting right now in this room, it's what you see in the image there. So this sits behind the aircraft simulator, and we are aiming to be the first in Australia, especially at a university, to integrate an airline, to have an integrated operations control center, which allows students to really experience a network control center for an airline. So with my experience at an airline here, our operations control center at the time looked exactly like this. So you have an operations controller, you'll also have a crewing officer, flight dispatch, maintenance. So it's a really good tool for students to develop an understanding of how network control operates and what the challenges are. And I think long term, once this is established, hopefully within the next several months, it should be up and running. But hopefully, give students the confidence to apply for these operational roles, which can be quite stressful, especially when you're just graduated from university and you have limited experience within aviation. And if you do want to enter in network or operations control, it's a lot of fun, but it is somewhat stressful sometimes. And I can give some more examples if we have time at the end of the presentation in terms of these individual roles, because you can apply them to any airline you work at. They're all quite similar. And other news, so the department and I, as I mentioned earlier, Professor Zane, Professor Tommy, myself, and a few others have been working. We're currently working on this project here, the RAS project, which is Regional Advanced Air Mobility. It's a surrogate trial, basically, to understand challenges, limitations, public acceptance. And we're working with some really successful external partners, how advanced air mobility aircraft can not only how it can be integrated, but how do we integrate it with the public being happy, of course? What would the potential uptake be? Our current regulations, very similar to my research. In fact, that's why I'm part of the project team, but it's it's still ongoing. It's a long project, and hopefully in the coming months we'll have a flight test period of about 10 days where we can fly this aircraft, but we're just currently waiting for the Civil Aviation Safety Authority to approve the application. And hopefully the results or the data we capture from these flights, then we can inform the regulator potentially on best practices for AAM. And we are focusing at this stage in Class G airspace, where for Australia it's uncontrolled airspace. So we're operating quite far from the city. Okay, so the aviation industry, generally, when you think of aviation, you may think of aircraft, airports, but it encompasses much more than that. So as you can see here, aircraft, cargo, airlines, the airport, and it's an interesting relationship because the airport wouldn't exist without the airlines, but also airlines require the airport to operate. So some may see an airport as basically a shopping center with runways, but they work quite closely together. There's a lot of strategy that goes around efficiency and getting aircraft out in and out on time. And I can't see what the bottom points are, but I believe they're connectivity. And I'll just try and remove this just so I can see. Yeah, connectivity and traffic. Yep. So obviously aviation connects people all around the world and businesses together, but aviation continues to increase even post-COVID. It's still perhaps almost recovered, but when it fully recovers, there are always going to be new airlines and new routes starting, and that will increase the traffic. So it's important to ensure that the industry remains safe and efficient. So our Bachelor in Aviation Management here allows students to potentially work with, I think I'll talk about this later on, but I'll just touch on it quickly. So they don't only have to work in industry. You can work in aviation from a government perspective or from a regulator such as CASA for Australia, which is the Civil Aviation Safety Authority. And they all come together and work on projects, which I mentioned earlier, the work integrated learning. I'll just go to the next slide and I'll mention it here a bit more. But essentially, your career, you have many options. You don't have to end up at an airline or an airport. You can end up in, say, maintenance or air cargo operations, which is much smaller than passenger operations for some countries. But some countries, such as, say, Hong Kong, I know Cathay Pacific have a huge cargo operation, especially with the 747-8s. So you can look at it from that perspective also. Flight dispatch, if you're interested in that, it's more so about, say, weight and balance for an aircraft, creating the flight plans. Aviation safety and human factors, that's very interesting. That could be, you could potentially work in the course allows you to understand what risk management is. For example, I'll just touch on risk management. So in part of our capstone project, which is quite significant for you students, it will allow you to really understand what a risk matrix is and how understanding risk is very important in aviation, especially in aviation when you're flying people basically in a tube at 40,000 feet with a few engines on the outside. So it's a very safe operation, but also there are SOPs and risk matrix, and of course solid training and understanding that all comes behind this. So, for example, if you're interested in, say, aviation safety, part of the course will go through a risk matrix and understanding risk management and risk assessments. So an example could be you are setting up maybe a new airport and you're the risk safety officer and you've gone out and you understand, okay, what are the hazards here if we operate to this airport? What are the risks based if these hazards happen? What causes these hazards and risks to take place? Who's responsible for any potential controls in place to mitigate the risks from happening? And then if you realize, okay, we're happy that the risk is quite low, but we want to make it lower, then you can always add a risk treatment plan, which allows a further reduction to the likelihood of that risk taking place. Unmanned aerial systems, similar to what I spoke about, basically AAMs. Aviation marketing, we touch on that. So if you're interested in a head office role, say for an airline, marketing is a huge department. It looks at everything from website to how do we promote new sectors and especially the leisure market. And of course, you've got a few more others here on the end. Finance, aviation regulator I spoke about. Of course, if you wanted to go down the pilot route, of course, and research and development, which is what I've done. And I don't think I actually mentioned my background. I'll just real quick. So I've been in the industry over a decade. I've worked at the airport, in head office, operations, management, and projects. And I started at Swinburne University in 2022, working on a PhD. So I'm working in research now and lecturing at the same time. And so there are opportunities to move around aviation, but you just need to have that solid foundation, and that's what the degree gives you. Okay, so in terms of the curriculum development, so as you know, so in conjunction with HKU Space, it's a top program and it's accredited with, it's always evolving to ensure that the students receive the not only the new curriculum, but while it provides more benefit for the students long term. And we mentioned here that the validity period is valid for around 5 years, was recommended. But if you have any more questions purely based on this, please reach out or reach out to your local contacts for further information. But essentially, the takeaway is it's a top up. It's an aviation management course, and it started in recent years. And here's just more information on basically what I was just mentioning. So across the 3 years, and the 8 top-up units are taught at HKU Space. And some of the subjects, I'll just read them out here. So aviation legal and regulatory frameworks, aircraft flight operations for managers, and that prepares you in the future if you do take on, say, an operations control role. It allows you to understand leadership, psychology, just understanding what it means to be a leader and what are the differences between management and leaders, or managers and leaders. And then the second year, you'll focus on aviation marketing, aviation project management implementation, and those capstone projects in the third year, which I'll talk about shortly. But they are a wonderful course for the students to undertake. And I did something similar during my time in the degree, even though it's quite a few years now. It allows you to really engage with industry, build those connections. In fact, one of the students I worked with closely last year, she was offered a job at an airport following her capstone project because the client and the industry had seen how passionate she was. She had the right attitude and she really understood the topic quite well. So this is the structure. It's so 8 top-up units taught at Hong Kong U Space. So keep that in mind. Again, if you have any further questions, please reach out and we'll get the answers for you. Okay, so the work integrated learning. I want to spend a bit of time on this. I'll just look. I'll start off on this page here. So essentially, this is in the final year of the degree, and for me, lecturing this on a sessional basis, and also acting as a client, as an industry partner, from my experience, it has been very, very rewarding because I've seen how the students have developed in terms of their semester one to semester two. Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll say on this side. So essentially, the semester starts, you get into groups, and because we have such great connections with industry, it could be, as I said before, from Cafe, Qantas, Jetstar, Melbourne Airport, could be air services, could be from the regulator, and you're engaging in real life challenges that these industries or these sectors within aviation may have. So the students have that real engagement. They build that relationship with the industry partner, and it allows them to not only network, which I think is most important in aviation. Sometimes it's once you have that great education in terms of foundation, then the next step is who you know, which is very important. So you set up real connections, you work on projects which are required in the industry, and it could allow you to apply what you've learned in the workplace in the future. So some of the projects that we've had, I can talk. I'll just mention five. We can go through five uh, right now. So let's say one of them could be, okay, the clients come to you. It's an airline. They would like you to operate to a new destination. So you will have to look at a two-stage approach. The first stage, the first part of the project, which is to understand, okay, what is the problem? What is the current academic literature say about it? What does the aviation industry say about it? And develop a proposal. So the proposal will include stuff like this is the client brief, this is the scope for the client brief. So you really have to understand what's in scope and out of scope. Challenges which we'd like students to learn from this is try and keep your scope quite tight. And this is something I struggle with my PhD. Sometimes the scope gets too large and we think we could change the world too, but we need to do it one step at a time. So it's very important to define and learn how to keep your scope quite tight. So once the students in a group, obviously while engaging with industry partner, while engaging with us in the department, you narrow down your scope. And then once you understand your scope, okay, who are your stakeholders? Who are the internal, external stakeholders? And you start to build up the proposal. And this is all in the first phase of this project. It's just purely building up that proposal. Also, you look at during the proposal, completing that risk assessment I mentioned earlier. So you use a established risk matrix to start building your risk assessment, and you can look at risks such as operational risk for the project or administration risks for the project or project management risk. For example, project management risk could be failing. Basically, the worst case would be to fail to deliver what the client wants, which is always first and foremost. And that's why it's so important to understand what the client wants. And once you have that, then you can understand, okay, this is the scope. These are the stakeholders which I need to engage with. This is what the risk assessment says. What's the operating environment I will be in? So once you do an analysis for that, then you have a really good understanding of, okay, this is what I need to consider. Then you propose it to your client. If the client's happy, then you move on to the next phase of the project, which is executing your proposal. And that's when you basically come up with a solution of how to achieve that, the client brief, whatever that may be. So I'll give you a few more examples. Some others requested a new rostering system for an airline. How do we make this more efficient? And other projects could be, how do we bring in a new aircraft into an existing airline fleet? Others could be advanced air mobility topics such as what should Brisbane do for the Olympics in 2032? What's the most efficient way to integrate AAMs for Brisbane and for the broader Australian population? And a few others could be a project for Melbourne Airport, which an airport reached out to us saying we would like to look at our redundancy plans, such as during weather. Sometimes it rains quite heavy, and it damages the airport terminal, how do we ensure that the operation gets back on track quite quickly? So the business the business needs to continue regardless. Sometimes, obviously, safety first, but once safety's taken care of, the operation needs to recommence. So that contingency plan, how do we get back on track quick? So that was one of the briefs which the students had. And I'm just trying to think of another relevant one, which you may find interesting. They're all quite interesting, but some are tougher than others. Another one could be uh, how do we launch the new Western Sydney airport, for example? So this is a new airport being established in New South Wales, and they may receive just a small portion of that, of course, not the whole thing, because you only have a year to work on this. So yeah, in summary, it's a wonderful experience based on industry connections. You learn a lot. You also learn how to work in groups, and most groups come up with challenges and they solve them themselves. But of course, we're there to support you if anything urgent comes up. So why is this relevant to the Hong Kong region? Well, obviously the third runway, you may know more than me. Hong Kong is a huge hub for passengers with Cathay and all the other operators in terms of passengers and cargo. It's well known to be a central point in the world for business. So there will definitely be heaps of opportunities there in Hong Kong, and the multimodal transport is extremely important. And with the introduction of AAMs in the future, and also the element of hydrogen coming in the future, and I believe it's starting to pick up in Hong Kong for the ground services equipment, basically the equipment used to service aircraft. So there's a lot happening in that space, and of course, aircraft maintenance will also always be required to ensure safety and the industry demand. So as I said earlier, even though with COVID there was a little bit of a bump, but the industry will always bounce back. It has in the past, such as after the global financial crisis in 2008. And the career prospects, I think as long as you got the education behind you, you're passionate, and you've got a good attitude, you can end up in any role you want, really, in aviation. And it's a wonderful industry to be part of. And it's quite small in a way because you start to build connections and people start to know each other quite well. Just see if I've got any questions. Just have a quick look. Nope, that seems okay. And in terms of the Australian aviation, I guess, sector, I've basically touched on all this already, but you've got a few major airlines here. I guess first and foremost, Qantas is a full service carrier. Then you have others such as Virgin, Jetstar, all in there working in their own market areas. And you got Bonza, who has started recently. And some of these airlines like Virgin, Jetstar do offer business class, but they target slightly different passengers to say the Qantas market share. But they're all always looking for a competitive advantage, and some could be operating to perhaps smaller airports within the country. Others could be offering frequent flyer points or discounts or better products on board. And airports, I touched on it again. So you have major airports which are owned by the same company. So, for example, I believe Melbourne Airport and Launceston Airport are owned by the same parent company. And of course, then you have the regulator, which is very important. So I've touched on CASA. The other one I can touch on is the ATSB. So that's the Australian Transport Safety Bureau. And if you do end up in a human factors part or air crash investigation or anything like that, that'll be a great department to work in. And we do have manufacturers here. So we do have, I believe, the 787 aircraft, part of the wing structure has been previously built here. And I don't want to say it's still built just in case it stopped, but there was a point where this was manufactured here in Australia and then shipped out to Seattle for assembly. And of course, and then you've got the education training and the sales channels. But mostly from my experience, a lot of the sales are pushed straight to online with less reliance on travel agents, but they still do play a role. But I think based on some research I've seen recently or some stats, the impact on travel agents has decreased slightly over the years, with more airlines pushing passengers to social media or their or their online website, or their website, I should say. And yeah, here's just another graph here. And as you can see, there was a positive relationship here in terms of growth within the industry. And it's slightly outdated just prior to COVID. But the reason I've left this in here is just to show that prior to COVID and after the global financial crisis I mentioned 2008, the industry did bounce back. And I'm sure it will get to the point where everything does definitely come back to normal. Pretty much in Australia, it has come back to normal. Probably a few international flights here and there are probably not operating as frequent, but in the next couple of years, we should see the industry continue to grow back on this path. Here are some, I'd like to talk to these images just quickly. So I'll put some images here, which I'll go through. I'll spend about 10 minutes going through this, and then we will finish off with any questions that you may have. And if you are a bit, if you're a bit shy to ask questions, feel free to reach out to your contacts or to me directly. I don't mind if you have any questions after. But here we've got James here, one of our students. He's a third year bachelor student, and as I was taking a few classes, I noticed he was very much interested in the capstone projects where I was the client. So I can mention that again. And this is the work in integrated learning I was talking about earlier, which you do in your final year, which is the 3008 and 3009 course, which takes place in the third year, which is the final year, as I said. And James worked on, I worked on establishing a client brief for the students, and it was in regards to, I think there was a topic in regards to the introduction of kiosks and how do we maintain airlines, how do we allow passengers to, how do we motivate passengers to use the kiosks, basically? Because having traditional counters at an airport, for example, it's costly to the airline. And of course, there is a cost using kiosks, but the cost is less. So less real estate is being used from the airline. Generally, it depends the structure, but some airports, some airlines own parts of the terminal, others lease them. So James was very interested in, for example, discussing with me, from my experience within the airlines, how do we motivate passengers to keep using kiosks? So move them away from the counters to use kiosks. But then the challenge is, okay, long-term airlines may not even use kiosks. They may transfer everything to their phones. So everything becomes an online boarding pass, and that doesn't require then kiosks long-term. So he was very interested in terms of, okay, based on the client brief, it allowed him to think, okay, I might want to end up in research here because it's very interesting. The industry has gone from using traditional counters to using kiosks and now moving on to mobile phone. And I believe there are some locations around the world, I forget which airports, but there's also autonomous boarding now. So with biodata, and so there's a lot happening in that space. And James was a very motivated student, and he was interested in spending time understanding how to get into research more, and hopefully he continues on that after he graduates this year. The bottom photo in the simulator, that's literally just behind in front of me. That's our Airbus A320 simulator, which I mentioned early in the presentation. So that was delivered and installed last year. And I'll just touch on how it's used. So for the management students in their capstone project, once again, which is the work integrated learning, we had a client brief where a client wanted to understand, for example, what do pilots go through certain critical phases of flight? So what the management students did, some were mixed management and pilots. What they did was they had eye tracking software to understand, okay, we have an approach coming into an airport, the pilot flying, where is he looking at that critical moment compared to the pilot monitoring, for example? And then we would pause the simulation and we can interview the pilots and say, okay, you were pilot monitoring according to the eye tracking system. Your eyes were not looking at the vertical descent or the airspeed or the altitude, whereas a pilot flying was focused purely on a visual approach. And then we can look at that data, analyze and understand, okay, the pilot monitoring, which should have been looking at the airspeed, for example, wasn't. And then we can understand, okay, why, what are the challenges? Was it due to stress? Was it weather related? Was it poor CRM? And it's a wonderful exercise, and the students really enjoyed. And I remember from the client last year, they were very happy with the outcomes that the students had. Another one they do is they wear a watch, excuse me, which allows them to understand, say, I guess, stress levels once again, not so much eye tracking, but just understanding stress levels of pilots during certain times of the flight. The most critical part of the flights are well known. It's generally takeoff, and perhaps landing is always a bit more than takeoff, because pilots generally there's a lot more going on, perhaps with slowing down the aircraft and making a good landing, keeping all the passengers happy. But yeah, the pilots do an amazing job during the takeoff and the landing phase, and generally the cruise element of the flight is the least stressful. But of course, we've seen in the past that things sometimes do go wrong, very rarely, but they do go wrong sometimes. And the pilots are well trained, and aviation as a whole have got SOPs set up for hopefully everything that is known at the moment. And I think with the introduction of AI in the coming years, it will continue to make aviation more safer, potentially in the simulation aspect. So pilots in the simulator, I mean, and then pilots can implement perhaps faster changes in the real world if something does happen. But yeah, so the capstone projects allow students to not only work on a particular project, but it gives them the ability to build skill sets and that confidence that they could solve any problem within the industry. And that's the whole idea. It's not so much looking at what marks students achieve, even though, yeah, that's important. At the end of the day, the most important thing for me personally is seeing students develop and learn and ask questions and push the boundaries, and just to understand that any problem can be solved. And the course structure at Swinburne allows that, because the students touch on a whole various topics across the board. And this photo here on the right-hand side here is where I'm sitting in now, which is our operations control center, which we're building at the moment. As I said, physically it's here. Now we're just working on the software, and hopefully should see that up and running in the coming months. And having worked in operations control for a major airline here for a few years, my initial training took about 6 weeks, and we're hoping that once students are engaged with this network control center and we integrate it with the A320 simulator, once they do undertake training at an airline, then potentially that 6 weeks may be reduced, which saves money for the airline, and also they'll go in feeling a lot more confident. And here are some photos from previous tours. Some have been in Hong Kong, some have been in London, and these are just some of our students. And you can probably spot Dr. Tommy here, and yep, there is here in the photo. So sometimes we have study tours. We did definitely have them prior to COVID, and we're going to start building that up again, where we take students on a trip, sometimes, or you can say around the world, and in various departments such as maintenance. So you can see one of our students there in one of the engines, in a simulator, and also at the Virgin Atlantic terminal, hangar, I should say. So hopefully that gives you some motivation, and yeah, keep developing that passion for aviation, because it's a wonderful industry to be part of. So that concludes my talk. Thank you for attending, and if anyone did ask any questions that I've missed it, please feel free to ask. And as I said earlier, just reach out to the team at Hong Kong U Space if you have any questions, or I've left my LinkedIn here. Feel free to contact me directly if you want, and I'm happy to get the answers for you, whether it's from Hong Kong U Space or from the department. And I'm sure there'll be questions I cannot answer, but I'll get the answers for you. So yeah, any questions? I'm available for the next 20 minutes or so, so you feel free to ask. Just see if there are any questions. Okay, we don't have any questions at this stage. I'll just try and reshare my screen here. Okay, we don't have any questions at the moment, but as I said, if any questions do pop up, please feel free to reach out to the aviation department at Swinburne or HKU Space, and we'll get the answer for you. Thank you for dialing in, and look forward to hopefully meeting you all in the future in the course. Take care. All the best. Bye.